Welcome back, friends. So, Graceland, the mythical residence of that storied Elvis Presley, the great legendary estate of the king himself, one that had been discussed over the years as if it rivaled the great halls of Europe and gives castles and palaces a run for their money. I mean, it was the home of the king after all. How could it not be the premier home of the South? Well, of the whole nation, for that matter, akin to the famous Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, built by Vanderbilt, a place where thousands of Elvis fans make a pilgrimage to each year. The grandeur of which those fans spend mortgage payments on to just be able to tour and buy little cheap made-in-China trinkets after their tour of the home. At least, that's what I had built up in my head while growing up. Let's see. I was a senior in high school. It was AEA week, and that's what they now call spring break. Daddy had planned a big home improvement extravaganza for us while we were out of school that week. The first 2 days of the week, he had us penciled in to help put on a new tin roof on the house. After that, the remaining days of the week would be spent tearing out the old shag carpeting, replacing the subfloor, and putting down wood floors throughout the entire house. Now, folks, that's a lot of work. Thankfully, we had a lot of help on hand from friends and family for the new roof, so that went by easily over those first 2 days. But when it came to the flooring, well, that was another matter entirely. The flooring was left to me, my sister, my mama, and Daddy. We didn't have the outside help for that task. We spent the end of the second day after the roof was finished tearing out the old carpet. Then the third day we spent tearing out the old particle board subflooring, and if you've never tried to tear out particle board subflooring, well, that's another story for another time. It seemed that this flooring project would take us at least the rest of the week. We were informed that we were to make no plans for that week. We would be tied up at home for the project. Well, of course, that didn't tickle my ears. My friends all had big plans for spring break. Well, that third day, my friend called me and asked me if I wanted to go with her and her mama to Memphis, Tennessee, to see Graceland. Of course, that sparked a need in me to hit the open road for an adventure. I told Mama about the call, and she laughed and said, "Son, you know your daddy said we were finishing this project before anyone did anything else." She was right, and there was no going against Daddy's word. I asked if I could go if we finished the work or got a tremendous bulk of it done. She said, "Well, you can try, but you best not mention anything about the trip to your daddy until you make a heck of a showing in the work, or we get done early." Well, deal on, Mama. So I buckled down and I worked like I had never worked before. As my Nanny Ree would say, I worked like a Trojan. I worked after the others had given up for the day, even after Daddy called it a day. I worked on into the evening, sawing those planks to size, and with rhythmic gusto I placed and hammered those planks onto the new subfloor one by one. By the time Thursday rolled around, we could see the end of the tunnel. Yes, the flooring was coming together. My friend's plan was to leave early Friday morning, get to Memphis, normally a 5-hour, maybe 6-hour at the most drive from our home, tour Graceland when we arrived, and then go to Beale Street that evening, then leave out Saturday morning coming home because her mama had to play the piano at church for Easter sunrise service on Sunday. Well, I gave it my all to make a good showing on the floor, and by lunchtime Thursday, I had worked up enough guts to ask Daddy if I could go on the trip the next day. When I did, he stood back and looked at the floor and said, "Yeah, son, y'all've made a good showing this week. I'm proud of you. Finish up the hallway and you can go tomorrow." Wow. He had never told me he was proud of me before. This was shaping up to be a good week. So Friday morning rolled around and my friend and her mom were in the driveway at 5 a.m. to pick me up. We set sail for Memphis. Now, I've always said that I and whoever I'm on a trip with could be the poster children for Traveler's Aid. Doesn't matter who it is or where we go. There's always odd occurrences, odd people, and, well, just overall oddness that transpires on every trip. Well, long story short, somehow we got mixed up on the directions, and that 5 or so hour trip to Memphis took about 8. Factor in bathroom breaks and gas stops and food detours. We hit Memphis wide open about 2 p.m. We spent about an hour circling the city on the freeway trying to find our way to the fabled Graceland. We finally found Elvis Presley Boulevard. We knew it wouldn't be long before we would find the mansion. Well, I kept wondering when we would be near our destination because it was not in the best of areas. I kept looking for things to improve the farther we went, but that didn't happen. I had about decided that we had once again got mixed up on our directions. Then, up ahead, I spotted a sign. It was the sign for Graceland. Well, I was looking around thinking it must have been a bootleg sign because I don't think anybody would put a mansion in this area. Well, I looked across the highway and I saw a set of familiar-looking gates that I recognized from pictures. Then I could just barely see the top of a roof of a house behind those gates and up and over some hills. I was a bit buffaloed by the scene, but I realized that this bad area must have grown up around the mansion over the years since it had been built many decades ago. So we pull in the parking lot of the Graceland Visitor Center, Hair Care, Tire Lube, and Video Rental Shopping Center complex. The afternoon was getting away from us. I believe the tour stopped accepting people at 6 p.m. and it was now rocking on close to 4. We bought our tickets and stood out front waiting for our short bus chariot to arrive and whisk us away to that glory land just beyond the gates. As our bus went through the gates and crested the hill and the mansion came into full view, I remember feeling a bit underwhelmed. I guess at the time it was built, it was considered a true mansion, but to modern standards, it felt just like a larger average home that had some fancy extra frills put on to spiffy it up a little bit. We tumbled off the bus and up the front steps and through the front door we went. Talk about stepping back into time. It really was like a time capsule. Interesting for sure, but not my backwoods teenage idea of stunning style. I guess for the time it was more hip. It was interesting to see how he lived and to hear the stories behind the rooms and items in the house. I enjoyed seeing the jungle room, but it felt like my bedroom back home was bigger, and that waterfall on the wall really had done a number on the atmosphere of that area of the house. It felt humid and, well, was musty and mildew smelling. It really was eye-opening to feel how small the house was in person. Again, I know it was built in another time, so I understood. It's just a funny reminder how we can get things built up in our own minds and imagine some pretty grand things, only to be let down when we experience the real thing. I guess you could always tie in the old sayings into this lesson, like, things are not always what they may seem, and the grass is not always greener on the other side. Anyways, we were rushed through the tour. As gaudy and mildewy as it was, I would have enjoyed a little more time to read the displays and such, even though I'm not even a big Elvis fan. That was my friend and her mama's department. After we made the short bus journey back to the visitor center, bait shop, moccasin outlet, and rockabilly cafe, we got into the horseless carriage and started our search for a hotel for the evening. That's when things started getting, well, weird. Aside from doubling our trip time and then paying good money to go through a dead man's house and oogling his possessions, that is. Now, this was a time before GPS in every vehicle. This was around 2005, and we were using an atlas and a map of Memphis that looked as though it was drawn on a rat-chewed cocktail napkin. We didn't want to stray too far from Elvis Presley Boulevard because we knew how to jump right back on the interstate towards home from the boulevard. So, up ahead we saw a big sign that read, "In Graceland." I-N-N, Graceland. Well, there used to be a brand name before the word "in," but it had been painted out, and the Graceland part was under the original name denoting the location of the brand name hotel. Well, with all of us tired and not wanting to get lost again, we pulled in and up the hill to the office. I did notice something different that I was from what I was accustomed to back home or anywhere I had traveled before. There was a gate arm that prevented cars from going past the office area into the back parking lots and where the hotel and motel wings were located. Now, in the position where we were on that hill, and the wings being down the hill behind the office, we just couldn't see the hotel really. All we could see was the office. Well, we walked in to get our rooms. My friend and her mother was going to get a room, and then I would get one separately. I look back now, and there were 2 red flags that should have alerted us to the fact this was not the quality of establishment we were all accustomed to. The lady behind the front desk was enclosed behind bulletproof glass, and there was a sign on the wall behind the lady that read, "No refunds after 15 minutes." So we registered and got our keys. My friend's mom asked the lady behind the glass where a good place to eat was close by and where to go on Bill Street. She said that she would prefer a place that wasn't a bar and didn't serve drinks, and that was family friendly. Well, the lady behind the glass looked at us and smirked a little bit and said, "Well, ma'am, you're not going to find anything like that on Bill Street." So our plans to take a gander at Bill Street was canceled. We exited the office and got into the car and passed through the gate arm with access granted from our room key. As we passed through the gate and started down the hill to find the wing our rooms was located in, it hit us that we might have made a mistake. The 2 or so buildings we passed by first were motel wings. For those of you who don't know the difference, motels are establishments with the doors to each of the rooms on the outside that you can motor up to. Hotels are establishments where the room doors are located on the inside of the hallway. Now, as we motored past the first 2 motel wings, we noticed a group of very loudly dressed women standing on the second-story walkway above us. A couple of them waved and whistled as we passed by. Now, I was in the back seat, so I was really getting a good look since I wasn't driving. Even as sheltered as I was, I knew they were selling services, and that was plain to see. Well, as we rounded the corner, we found Building 3, which was a little newer hotel wing, but just a couple of years newer than the motel wings, probably built in the 70s. We pulled up, jumped out with our bags, and went into the building. We found our rooms, and the plan was to get ready to go out for supper. Well, the ladies went to their room, and I found mine. I opened the door, and it was like stepping back into the jungle room over at Graceland. Except this room had not been preserved, and it wasn't a new room decorated to look retro. It had what at one time was cream-colored shag carpet, now a dingy brown. The walls had wallpaper hanging off, and one wall was all brick. The curtains that shielded the view of the courtyard filled with the evening workers was held up with very large safety pins, the size of bananas. I put my duffel bag down on the desk and took out what I needed, and I headed to the bathroom for a shower to wash away the film of travel smut that accumulates while on the road. Also to wash the jungle room mildew off. Well, the shower didn't drain, so that was fun. After my shower, I finished getting ready and was bent over placing some items back in my duffel bag when I raised back up and caught my reflection in the mirror above the desk. I screamed like a little girl, because in that reflection there was the image of a man looking back at me, standing behind me. I wheeled around ready to fight, but no one was there. I turned back around to look in the mirror again, but his image was gone. Well, I quickly put my stuff away and I left the room to go to the ladies' room. When I arrived at the door of their room, it was standing wide open. I knocked on the door frame and announced my arrival. I noticed a big old Schwinn bicycle propped up against the wall in the hallway next to their open door. Well, not knowing what was going on, I just went on in their room. I looked to my left, and there was a man just standing over the tub looking into the tub. He didn't look up to acknowledge me. I walked on past the bathroom, and when I got past the corner of the wall, there my friend and her mama sat next to each other on the end of one of the beds. So close you couldn't fit a sheet of paper in betwixt them. They looked up at me like deer in headlights. I asked what on earth was going on. It felt like I had just walked into a hostage situation. They both just shook their heads and pointed towards the bathroom. I said, "Yeah, I noticed that. Who is he and what is he doing?" One of them replied that he was the maintenance man that showed up after they called the front desk to report their tub wasn't draining. I told them that mine had not drained either. Well, about that time the man entered the room where we were and announced that it was fixed, and off he went. He got on his bicycle and rode it down the hallway, and when he came to the door at the end of the hallway, he barely slowed down while busting through it onto the sidewalk outside. Well, after that, the ladies decided to forego their showers before we went out to eat that evening, as the evening was slipping away from us. Now, folks, I don't remember where we went to eat that evening, which is unusual because I usually remember everything, but not this case. I guess the exposure to mildew in the jungle room had shorted out my memory. I do remember a great discussion was held about starting out early enough the next morning to beat the severe storms that were predicted for that area. So we returned that evening to the hotel motel. Upon our entrance to the back parking lot, the group we had encountered on our arrival earlier was nowhere to be seen. We went to our rooms and agreed to be up and early the next morning, early enough to beat the storms. Well, when I got into my room and locked every locking mechanism on that door, and after pushing 2 chairs up against that door, I went over to the bed and pulled back the sheets. Well, they needed a good shave and a good session with a lint roller. I just decided to grin and bear it, and I jumped on into bed. Well, after laying there, with every light in the room on and a towel covering that mirror that I had seen that reflection in before, I finally fell asleep listening to the weather coverage on the TV. Now, that night, those storms that were predicted for around 7 a.m. sped up and hit Memphis about 4 a.m. I was jolted from my sleep by hail hitting the window of the room. It felt as though the whole building was swaying back and forth in the wind. The lights were blinking in and out, and then the tornado sirens went off. I looked at the TV, and we were under a severe thunderstorm warning, and apparently there had been a twister indicated on the radar a few miles away, but it seemed as though it was right on the top of us. The wicker light fixture over the small table in the room next to the bed was swinging back and forth. I felt a draft of warm, humid air coming through the big window and from around that curtain which was hanging on for dear life on those safety pins. I thought, oh Lord, please don't let this be the place I go out of this world from. I mean a seedy motel on the outskirts of Memphis. The cracking of the hail against the window grew harder and harder. I just knew it was about to bust that window out. Then, as it seems to always do in the South, it got real quiet all of a sudden. Now, this could mean one of two things. It could mean that the storm has passed by and you're in the clear. Or it could mean that the tornado is upon you and it's too late. I sat up in bed and waited and listened. After a few seconds, there was still no sound or activity, and the sirens had stopped. Either the storm got the sirens, or it was over. Well, thankfully it was over. I lay back down and I tried to go back to sleep until it was time for my alarm to go off, but to no avail. My alarm went off and I got up. I took a quick shower, trying to beat the water before it got up above my ankles. And after my shower, I didn't piddle around and give time for that strange reflection to appear again. I grabbed my bag and left that room in the dust. I made it back to the ladies' room and knocked. They let me in, and we compared stories about the storm and talked about the weird maintenance man from the night before. They quickly packed up, and we headed out. When we got to the end of the hotel hallway and exited to the outside, there was a big blue plastic garbage drum to the right. I looked over in it, and there was a huge blonde curly wig that looked like it had been shot out of a cannon, laying there in the barrel. It was obviously one of those cheap, terrible wigs from a Halloween store. Parts of it looked as though it had been melted in some terrible event that my little sheltered 18-year-old mind just couldn't even imagine. I noticed under the wig was a black rubber thigh-high boot with the heel broken off. Now, I can only imagine that these items had belonged to one of those ladies of the night we encountered the evening before upon our arrival. We finally made it to the car in one piece. We loaded up, and just as we were closing the doors, gunfire rang out. Well, my friend put it into gear, and we burnt rubber out of that place, and as we did, I just laid down across the back seat. I guess she caught me falling across the back seat out of the corner of her eye or from the rearview mirror. Because when I pulled that maneuver, she hollered, "Have you been shot?" "No," I replied. "Keep going," as I waved my hand towards the exit. I believe we went airborne for a second as we crossed that speed bump at the exit of the parking lot. Since the storm had arrived early, done its thing, and moved on, we had a little time to spend before we got on the interstate back home. We hit up that cafe attached to the Graceland Visitor Center, glamour shot parlor, and smoke shop. We had banana and bacon sandwiches, said to be Elvis's favorite. We then left out for Sweet Home, Alabama. I always love a good adventure, and that was certainly an adventure. I had to leave out more than half of the tales from that trip due to time constraints for the show, though. Just when I saw the light at the end of the tunnel now, that we were back on the road towards home, that light was somewhat dim, because we turned that 5-hour trip home into a 7-hour trip. But at least it was a little shorter than the trip up there. Well, friends, that was the story of my pilgrimage to Elvis's Graceland. Now, it was an abbreviated story. I left out over half the tales I could have told during it. Maybe one day I'll tell the full story. But in the meantime, if you don't mind, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I hope you've enjoyed this. Y'all be blessed.